My name is Paul Lincoln. I'm your host for Soil Matters, a podcast from the British Society of Soil Science, the professional body for soil scientists in the UK. Welcome to the 5th episode. Soil Matters connects scientific research with practical application. Our topic today is regenerative agriculture, and we're asking what is it and what makes it work. Today, I'm delighted to welcome 3 speakers with both a professional and a personal interest in the subject. Kate Humble is a broadcaster and author who has specialized in wildlife and science programs, including Orbit, Back to the Land, Animal Park, Escape to the Farm, and Springwatch. Kate was also included in the BBC Radio 4 Women's Hour Power List for 2020. In 2011, she took over a small farm in the county of Monmouthshire, where she founded Humble by Nature, a rural enterprise supporting artisanship and exploring how farming can work with nature. Earlier this year, she was appointed a BSSS Patron, a role she says she was delighted to accept because she loves mud. Andy Cato is an award-winning farmer and musician. What started out as a personal quest for self-sufficiency after purchasing a farm in Gascony has developed into a deep commitment to scaling regenerative farming. Today, a proud National Trust tenant farmer, Andy is co-founder of the food and farming business Wildfarmed, that is on a mission to accelerate the world's transition to regenerative agriculture and make regeneratively farmed food accessible to everyone. And he also stars in Series 3 of Clarkson's Farm. Dr. Lizzie Sagoo will be known to many listeners. She is a soil scientist and also Associate Managing Director at ADAS Sustainable Agricultural Systems. And last year, she became President-Elect of the British Society of Soil Science. So welcome to everyone. Let's start with you, Kate. Hi, Kate, you bought your own small holding. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, without wanting to show off, I have a small holding and a farm. So the small holding was the first part of my kind of soil journey, if you like. We bought a 4-acre piece of land with a house in the Wye Valley in Monmouthshire. We are in Wales, but looking at England, looking at Offa's Dyke. And the land that we took on was principally, had been pasture, had been grazed. It's very steep, it's very rocky. We are surrounded by ancient woodland. We're in what was once known as an area of outstanding natural beauty, now known as a national landscape. I'm not entirely sure why. And initially, we, a little bit like Andy, we thought, well, we're going to try and be as self-sufficient as possible, and started like a lot of smallholders with chickens, because that's sort of good entry-level stuff and they're not too complicated, or you don't think they're complicated. Actually, chickens think otherwise. You know, we graduated on to geese and then got the wrong sort of pigs. And we basically just made a lot of smallholding mistakes. But one of the things that having that piece of land taught me was that you realise very quickly that you don't own land. I mean, it's probably the other way around, that land owns you, but certainly that you are simply a guardian or caretaker of a piece of land during the time that it's in your ownership or in your care. And over the years, we've lived here now for coming up to 18 years. And over those years, we've realised that it's an enormous responsibility. It's scary as hell. I mean, I know Andy and I have talked about this before. You know, you take on a piece of land and you think, oh, it's going to be great. You know, I'm going to wander around like Felicity Kendall in The Good Life, and everything's going to grow and everything's going to flourish and it's all going to be wonderful. And nature isn't like that. Nature makes you work hard. Nature makes you want to learn. And in recent years, what we've realised is that actually it's not great land for pasture. It's not great land for grazing. And what can we do better? How can we serve this land better? I'm on a huge learning curve, but in a very privileged position to not have to make my living from it. So in a way, I can muck about. You know, I'm delighted. This year, I've managed to grow, you know, quite a lot of stuff. My carrots are gloriously wonky, which apparently is a good thing. And I'm really starting to appreciate soil and what it can do as long as you look after it. The farm, which we took on 12 years ago, was a sort of rescue mission it was an emotional response to a couple who had been tenants on the farm for 33 years and had retired, handed in their notice to the council. They were council tenants, and the council immediately came round and said, we're going to break up the farm and sell it off in parcels of land. And, anyone might think, well, that's probably reasonable. The farm belongs to the council. The couple are retiring. They're not being thrown off the land. Surely the council has every right to do whatever it wants to. And it kind of does. But my feeling was, first of all, don't we need these small farms? Don't we need to make sure that our land is in the care of people who want to look after the land? And this couple had absolutely done that. And that for people who want to farm, again, I'm sure Andy can chip in here, but for people who want to farm, it's really difficult to buy a farm. They're expensive, and small farms like ours, 100 acres, are increasingly rare because, they are labelled very thoroughly not viable.
Let me ask you a bit before you go into detail on the farm. Tell me a bit more about what you grow on your small holding.
Just veg for home. I hate having to buy salad in a plastic bag. It seems ridiculous. So I thought, well, I haven't got very green fingers. Everyone assumes that because I'm the girl who does country stuff on the telly, I must be able to grow everything. I can't. I'm absolutely rubbish. But I'm getting better and I'm learning. And so I thought, well, I'll start with salad because that's apparently quite easy. So I grow lots of salad. I grow lots of herbs. Again, things that, I was buying in plastic bags and thought this is ridiculous. Grow lots of herbs. And things like spinach that I eat loads of and is incredibly easy. Chard. I had great success with broad beans. My courgettes were so prolific. I've now got an enormous crop of marrows, if anyone wants one. Butternut squash coming beautifully. I've been learning about companion planting, so I've got marigolds all over the place. And have just also planted a lot of flowering perennials around the veg to encourage pollinators. And this year, because it's been so dry and so sunny, actually, it's been quite a good year for butterflies, which is wonderful. But it also means it's been quite a good year for caterpillars. So I did have to donate my purple sprouting broccoli to the cabbage white. And I thought, well, you know what? We've had so few butterflies in recent years. I suspect this is a donation worth making.
And tell me a bit about your commitment to regenerative agriculture. What does that mean to you?
I think my commitment is more to regenerative farmers rather than regenerative agriculture, because, as I say, I'm not really at the coalface of farming. I sort of flit around at the edges of it, and I talk about it and I communicate it, and I hope that through working with regenerative farmers, I can help unpack what it does actually mean to people, because I think everyone involved in this podcast knows that terms like regenerative farming, like organic, they become almost meaningless because they're used so much. And actually, when you say to somebody, what does it actually mean? What does that actually entail? Often it's quite difficult to explain or understand. And I'm still really getting to grips with the idea of regenerative agriculture, because I don't think it's necessarily a very specific term. But essentially for me, I live in an area where there are a lot of young people coming into farming, which is really interesting and kind of bucking a trend. A lot of them are first-generation farmers. They haven't come from farming backgrounds. People might call them idealists because they are trying to farm, as you said in the introduction about what we're trying to do on our farm, to farm with nature rather than battling against it. So for me, part of regenerative farming is taking a lead from nature, looking at nature and saying, what do you do best, and how can we, as guardians of the land, help you do your best? And instead of trying to force something to work on a piece of land that is actually consistently telling you, don't do this because it's not going to work, and you can chuck all the chemical fertilizers you like at me, or you can do whatever you like, but it's not going to work. Listening. And I think this is the really interesting thing about what's happening locally in our area is these young farmers who are not taking the way to regenerate land is to take all grazing animals off. no, it's not. We need grazing animals. Some of our most important ecosystems have evolved to be grazed by big herbivores and by different herbivores with different teeth and different tastes. And so people are starting to look at, well, how do we best combine the herbivores that actually can generate an income for a farm, but also help facilitate the idea of regenerating land and getting it back to health. So for me, regenerative agriculture is sort of an intricate dance or a patchwork quilt of finding the various elements that suit that piece of land. And I think that's the key thing here. And again, I know Andy and Lizzie will say this with much more authority than me, but the key thing is that, my land is going to be different from Andy's land. It's going to be different from the land that Lizzie works on or knows. Literally, I could go to my neighbour's land next door and the soil will be different, maybe because it's been treated differently or
Sure.
it's been worked differently. So the idea of regenerative agriculture being a kind of one size fits all, everybody does this and it will work, is obviously not right. What's exciting about regenerative agriculture is it is a deep dive into how we can work in partnership with nature for everybody and every living thing's benefit. And that's what excites me about the idea of regenerative agriculture.
That's really helpful. Tell us about some of the processes that you use, either on the smallholding or the farm.
So, as I say, we're really just at the beginning of it. Our farm, we're not very high, but we're essentially a mountain farm, not on a mountain, because we get all the mountain weather. We're on a ridge. We're on the edge of a village called Penalt, which means top of the hill. We are the top of the hill. And even though we're under 300 meters, as I say, we've got the Black Mountains gloriously in view, and they send us all the weather that they like, and we get the full brunt of it. Our land is very rocky. Our soil is quite clay heavy, and oddly we get quite waterlogged, which sort of, there are all sorts of kind of oddities about our little piece of land, but it's not great for growing because it is quite exposed. So principally we're livestock. We have Welsh sheep and a suckler herd of Hereford cross cattle, a couple of pigs, so we have a sort of mixed farm. We've tried to grow apple and pear trees, partly because Monmouthshire has a great heritage of growing and making excellent cider, which I love. They're now 12 years old and still struggling to give us any fruit because of the conditions. So really what we're doing to try and ensure that our land is healthy, both, to produce good grass, good natural feed for the livestock, but also to work for wildlife, is to make sure that we have things that protect the soil. Things like, we had hedges, we've put in more hedges, we've laid those hedges. So we have these wonderful now protected enclosures, which means that, it's a very windy place, but we're not losing lots of soil through wind because we've got these lovely protective barriers around all our fields, which has the added advantage of also protecting the sheep from the wind and the cattle from the wind. We've planted lots of trees. Again, trees, everyone thinks that trees are wonderful things to look at, as they are, but what trees do to the soil and how the soil and trees interact is really interesting. And, that's going to be a long process. We'll start to see the benefits of those long after I've gone. We're careful about water. We've got scrapes and cleared ditches so that we're basically trying to make sure the land is cosseted, if you like, that we're protecting it. So it's not really how we work the land, because we're not, as I say, we're not ploughing, we're not sowing, we're not having to disturb the land in that way. So what our approach has been very much to make sure that the land that we've got is treated in a way that allows it to maintain its health and maintain its benefits then to the livestock. We don't fertilize, we test our soils, we don't need to fertilize, so we don't. Sometimes we'll put in field margins of pollen-rich plants and things like that. But essentially, we sort of let it do its own thing combined with our livestock and just make sure that we're treating it as well as we can.
Which leads on to a question about biodiversity and tackling climate emergency. In terms of your small holding, is it possible to say how much of a contribution this small holding is making?
In kind of scientific figures and percentages?
No.
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 But, the bottom line is that anyone doing anything, however small, is contributing something positive. And that's really the thing that matters. I think we can all feel very disempowered and slightly helpless at times when we hear about the scale of biodiversity loss, of the impacts of climate change. And there are so many things that we feel that we can't control, that they're so big and the impacts are so sort of otherworldly, whether it's enormous storms or wildfires and, things that we feel as individuals we can't really do anything about. But I think anyone who tries to grow something, tries to consume a little bit less, tries to, look after their patch, however big or small that patch is doing something positive, and they should take pride in that. And when I walk around my small holding and, just look at the bees on the flowers and think, well, I've provided those flowers, I'm doing something good. When I when I donate my broccoli to the cabbage white caterpillars, I feel good about that. That's another little thing that we didn't have last year. We've put ponds in. We've got ponds everywhere. I mean, at the moment, because we've basically haven't really seen any rain since February, they're more or less dry, but they're not entirely dry. We made them deep enough that hopefully they've got some resilience. So, as I say, for me, I take gentle pride and lots of satisfaction in the fact that, have I increased, national biodiversity by 1%, 10%, 15%? No idea. But I have increased it. Or at least I haven't done anything, I hope, to impact negatively on it.
Do you have one lesson that you'd want to share with our listeners based on this experience?
I think don't be swept up or scared by terms like regenerative. Don't think that you have to jump on a bandwagon or do something to tick a box. It's an enormously joyful and rewarding process. Sometimes just sitting on a patch of grass and thinking, what do you want me to do with you? I think my lesson would be just take a moment to look at nature and listen to it, and then take joy in making it your partner, not your foe.
Fabulous. Thank you. Well, at this point, I'd like to turn to Andy. Andy, you sold your music rights to buy a farm in Gascony. Tell us a little about your journey into regenerative agriculture and tell us what prompted and inspired you to make this move.
Well, I was a musician and I had a much easier life playing music than growing food, as I would find out. But I was coming back from a gig one day and picked up an article about the environmental consequences of food production. It was very sobering, and it had a line in it which said, if you don't like the system, don't depend on it. And that's what inspired me to buy John Seymour's Guide to Self-Sufficiency and start trying to grow food and plant my first seeds. And to cut a very long story short, from the moment that I'd seen those seeds become plants and plants become food on the table for all of the things I was obviously getting wrong and all the setbacks, I went down a spectacularly sized rabbit hole, which, as you said, culminated in selling my musician's pension to finance buying a farm up the road. When I did buy a farm up the road, it was a disaster and a very, very humbling experience that's kind of shaped everything that's happened since, really.
And tell us about where your farm is now and what you focus on in terms of what you grow.
Well, after the disastrous years in France, I was kind of forced to, it was very humbling lesson in how hard it is to be a farmer, how hard it is to bring degraded soils back to life, particularly in a market that places no value on any of that, only how many tons you produce, how lonely it is farming, and the vast array of skills, absolutely vast array of skills it requires. Anyway, when that finally yielded, that sort of enforced decade of R&D, if you like, yielded some metaphorical fruit, mainly in the form of wheat. And we ended up with a farm bakery and growing cereals in companion plants, all sorts of different ways, but basically in a nature-rich environment. And it was basically seeing the local people there in France having agency with their food choices to support the nature because it tastes good, because it was more digestible, whatever the reason. With my co-founders of Wildfarmed, Ed and George, friends of mine then, we looked at the extent of the ecological crises which we face. And the question was, how can we make this a choice for as many farmers as possible and for as many high street shoppers as possible? So that led to setting up Wildfarmed. That required coming back to the UK. And as Kate mentioned, no one, apart from a very handful of people, could ever buy any land here anymore. The value of it is completely divorced from its productive potential. So I was very lucky to get a National Trust tenancy, where I'm speaking to you from now. So I rent a farm from the National Trust about an hour west of London near Swindon.
And your commitment is to regenerative agriculture. Tell us what this means on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I suppose the clue's in the name, isn't it? It was coined in the 80s by an American called Rodale, started talking about the fact that sustaining what we have, ecosystems in the state that we have, is not enough. So how can you grow food at the same time as making all of that better? And there are, pretty universal principles, general principles, which essentially, as Kate was saying, come down to mimicking nature. I suppose the most important one is keeping soil covered with a diversity of plants all of the time, or certainly as much of the time as you can, limiting soil disturbance, either chemical or mechanical, diversity at all turns, including integrating livestock wherever you can. So basically, agriculture, I suppose, based on biology, rather than based on the suppression of nature through chemistry, which is what we've done for a very long time.
And say a word about some of the processes that you routinely make use of.
Well, I suppose the sort of big three would be cover crops. So I guess many listeners would know what they are, but for those that don't, so for example, now we've just finished harvesting, and some of the fields will be replanted to a winter sown crop in 6 weeks, couple of months. And some of the others will be planted to a spring crop next spring. So you would often see traditionally those fields left bare all winter long, ploughed, and left to kind of the winter weather works the ploughed field down to a kind of nice seed bed. But all the time that soil is bare, it's dying and being washed away and blown away. So in those fields, we'll plant a cover crop, which we're not going to harvest, but it's literally going to do that. It's going to cover the soil all winter long ahead of the spring planting. And you can design that cover crop to do whatever you need to do in terms of soil structure or nutrients or whatever. The second one would be to try and avoid monocultures as best you can. So planting cereals with a companion crop, again, trying to bring this idea of diversity in at all times. So that might be growing wheat with beans or barley with pea, or there's innumerable variations on that. And the third one I would say is switching to nutrition based on need. So all of our wild farm growers use a thing called SAP analysis, which is basically a blood test for a plant, and it gives you real-time readouts of what the micronutrients going on in that plant are, and it allows you to correct them and apply just enough to try and keep the system in equilibrium, ultimately to optimize photosynthesis, because the only energy that's going to restore any soil is coming from the sun. So we need to keep the plants turning that sunlight into sugars.
And in what way would you say, speaking generally, are your processes different from those of more traditional methods?
Well, I suppose the fundamental starting point of the last several decades, but it was actually it's a millennia-old process where we've been suppressing nature. We just got more powerful tools to do it recently. The starting point, I suppose, is treating soil as something to keep the plants upright, and everything else is going to be brought in, both the nutrition to feed them, and inevitably when plants are given a handful and generally excessive macronutrients and no micronutrients, as we would, they get sick. So all of the fungicides, insecticides, and all the rest of it that inevitably follow. It was much more a kind of recipe book approach. And what we're trying to do is honor nature's foundational principles of diversity and soil coverage, and observe and manage to push that forwards rather than push it out the way.
How common do you think the approach that you are taking is generally across farming in the UK?
Well, if you go to Groundswell, which is the big kind of regen ag get together, a fantastic event hosted by the Cherry family. There were 10,000 people there this year. You would come away thinking everyone's doing it. If you look at the statistics, it's 99% of people aren't doing it, and the reason for that is a very good one, in that farmers are incentivized for one thing: yield at all costs. And as the weather gets more and more extreme, farmers who've been pushed to the absolute financial brink, paid at or less than the cost of production for decades, are now faced with increasingly wild weather. And what happens in those highly stressful situations is you do whatever you need to do just to stay in business. And so unless you can create a new economic model, surround farmers with agronomy support, technical support, community support, just create a much more holistic approach. What we can't now do to farmers who've been pushed to the limits is to say, actually, without any changes in the economic model, can you now also provide us with clean rivers, more bees, and so on, because it's not a reasonable demand.
Okay, and tell us, you've been working with Jeremy Clarkson on his program. Tell us about the extent to which you brought thinking along these lines to that program.
It was a most unexpected development. I went round there for a cup of tea, and the cameras were rolling, and my brain sort of whirred, thinking, you're about to define regen farming for 50 million people. Do not get this wrong. But actually, a really good way of talking about all of this is to just dig up some soil that's been cultivated for a long time from the middle of the field, and then go over to the hedge and dig up some soil from under the hedge. And you don't need to be a soil scientist to instinctively know that we've got a problem, and we need the soil in the field to be more like the soil in the hedge if we're going to be resilient in the face of droughts and floods. Never mind talk about food as medicine, and recognize that the NHS all starts in the field, and all the other ramifications of soil health. And so from that starting point, we started applying some of these principles that we've been talking about in the field. So wheat and beans growing together. And then after that episode finished, we went into a cover crop. And the reality is that, take the cameras out of it, that managing crops in this way is a very radical shift. And there are lots of practical as well as mindset barriers to this. For example, if you're a contractor, I said a lot of farms, they can't afford equipment these days because it's just eye-wateringly expensive. So contractors will do the farm work for loads of farms. And for them to pay for their £500,000 combine harvesters and sprayers and all the rest of it, the only way to do that is to cover huge amounts of acres. And the only way to be able to cover huge amounts of acres is to do the same thing in all of those acres really fast. And so if you're trying to bring a new approach, an observation approach, which is going to require different interventions at different times, it's not easy to make these switches on any level. And it's obviously not easy to do that when the cameras are rolling. And I knew that, but went into it thinking, if we can have a field here where you've got wheat, but it's also got flowers in it, it's got insects in it, it's got bees in it, it's weed-free and it's disease-free without the use of insecticides and herbicides to do that, then just as a way of opening the idea that there's another possibility here, there's no greater forum to be able to do that. And from the people who stop me in motorway service stations quite a lot these days, in the way they never did before after 25 years of music, 2 minutes on that show has changed everything. But, people often want pictures, and they often talk about me being the nature bloke, the soil bloke, or the biodiversity bloke from Clarkson's, and the fact that those terms are being mentioned whilst, waiting at a Starbucks is definitely a step forward.
Brilliant. And you mentioned you run a company that not only grows but distributes food to major supermarkets. Tell us a bit about this, please.
Well, I suppose the idea was, going back to that French farmyard, there was a direct connection there between people's food choices and how it was grown. And when you go into a supermarket, you have all this choice, but choice you don't have is knowing who grew the food and how they grew it, almost without exception. And so as long as that's the case, it's all very well saying to people, actually, your food choices are your greatest point of agency for a livable future, for nature, for all these Attenborough programs. Are actually all the stuff that we love are going to be, they're going to live or die on our relationship with the land, how we grow our food, all of this stuff. If people then can't go to a high street near them at a price they can afford and buy food from farmers who are doing something about it, it's kind of hot air. So what we wanted to do was create a field to plate supply chain that got all the way through to Tesco's and Waitrose and Nando's and Ask Pizza and all these people that we're working with now. And so the form that now takes is about 150 farmers, about 1,000 food businesses. A lot of them are small micro bakeries all the way up to Tesco's. And we've created a segregated supply chain. So the grains from those farmers goes all the way through. And the farmers grow to a sort of wild-farmed set of protocols. And the exciting, one of the exciting bits in this story at the moment is that we defined our protocols in the way that, for example, organic has a set of do's and don'ts. You can do this and you can't do that. But as Kate was saying, every field is different, every soil is different. So the dream was always a kind of outcomes-based system. And over the last few years, we've been working really hard to say, right, what we want to say to our customers is the grain is pesticide-free, it's better for nature, it's better for carbon, and it avoids river pollution. How can we measure that in a scalable and affordable way? And we've got there now. And so we're right on the cusp of switching to an outcomes-based approach, so we can say to our customers this year, in wild farm fields last year relative to neighbouring conventional fields, there were 3.7 times as many bees and there was twice the insect biomass. So this is great in terms of making this story real for customers, but it's also great because what you can measure, you can value. So we've got our farmers being paid now by water companies because it's cheaper for them to avoid water pollution at source than get it out afterwards. So outcomes, I think, are really important, both for being clear with customers and getting people behind this movement, but also getting farmers paid not just for how many tons of grain, but for the quality of the ecosystem in which it was grown.
And do you think you've basically created a model that could be replicated across the country for encouraging groups of farmers to change their ways of working?
I'd like to think we're in the process of doing so. It's damned hard. I can tell you that like DJing is an awful lot easier. And actually, when you get into the details of these, we created these hugely impressive supply chains, arguably answering the wrong questions, but within them are extraordinary levels of expertise. And so what we found on the one hand is endless depths of complexity when you're trying to change it, but equally endless depths of really extraordinary people who, once the opportunity is given to participate in this sort of joined up field to plate mission, they really want to help.
And let me ask you exactly the question that I asked Kate about what is your contribution, do you think, to tackling biodiversity and climate emergency?
Well, I suppose, we're measuring that. So the details that I gave on insects and bees was across the wild farms. It's not me, but it's across the wild farmed growers. This 3.7 increase in bees and the doubling of the insect biomass. So that on the 150 farms that we're working with is not in and of itself going to move the needle. Yep. But what I'd like to hope is that we are actively demonstrating, one, that this long shadow that we've had ever since the first well-intentioned agro-environmental schemes were drawn up in the 80s, which pitted nature against food, said if we want more nature, we need less food. And actually, we have to have both in the same place at the same time for all sorts of reasons if we're going to build a resilient and abundant future. So hopefully we're proving that that's the case. And secondly, hopefully proving that you can make high street food from farmers who are pushing things forward and try and carve out fair value all the way up the supply chain.
Thank you. I want to turn to you, Lizzie, now to reflect on some of the comments that we've made so far. The first thing I wanted to ask you is what are the real world applications of regenerative agriculture? And can you talk about its potential? I mean, we can clearly see the sector is being revolutionized, but I suppose my question to you is, what's the potential to revolutionize the sector completely?
Okay. So I think regen ag, it's a grassroots movement that's been driven by farmers. So in terms of its potential, I think the principles and learnings are directly relevant across the sector. I would say that some of the principles aren't new, things like reducing tillage, keeping the soil covered. It's basic good soil management that we've been talking to farmers about for many years. But the recent attention and interest in regen ag has led many farmers to kind of look at their farming system and what they're doing and ways for them to incorporate as many of the regen ag principles as possible. And those principles, the things that Andy was describing, they have the potential to contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improve soil organic matter, and overall soil health. I think change takes time, so I'm all for a revolution, but I think it's probably more likely to be an evolution rather than a revolution.
Okay, and how realistic do you think it is for these approaches to be really widespread over time? Obviously, I appreciate that point.
So I think it is realistic that the principles of regen ag can be used to inform change to farm practice, over scale on many farms. However, we need to be flexible, and both Kate and Andy picked this up. Kate, you said about it needs to suit the land. We need to recognise that we have lots of different soil types and lots of different farming systems, and this will affect the extent to which the principles and practices can be adopted on individual farms. So I think it's important to see it as a set of principles rather than a set of rules.
Okay, and you've mentioned zero tillage. What are its benefits, and what is the impact on crop yields normally?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work done on this. I mean, key benefits, two key benefits: reduction in cost, potential improvements in soil quality. So if we move from a conventional tillage system to a zero tillage system, we'll save time and we'll save diesel costs from the cultivation. From a soil quality perspective, you've got potential improvements to soil structure and the soil organic matter content. But no, I said potential improvements. So in terms of soil structure, cultivations can weaken soil structure. So cultivations also remove natural soil structure. So any structure that develops from cracking of the soil or earthworm and root channels will be disturbed by the tillage. Cultivation also aerates the soil and encourages the breakdown of soil organic matter. So if we move to a no tillage system, it will help sort of slow the breakdown of that organic matter. There is a but though. If your soil becomes compacted, you may suffer from reduction in yield if you don't remove that compaction with tillage. And cultivation's also important in terms of weed control. So I think we've got to remember that not all crops are suitable for no-till systems as well. It's not possible to grow a crop like potatoes at scale in no-till. I think the principles of reducing or removing tillage where it's achievable is definitely a good thing. There are benefits of doing that. But again, it comes down to this word of flexibility. We need to maintain a flexible, open-minded approach and willing to consider that under certain circumstances, some tillage might be needed.
Andy's already touched on the issue of profitability at the moment. What do you think are the best strategies for farmers to adopt in order to basically move in this direction, but also obviously to survive financially?
I think it's really important to learn from what other people are doing. Learn from other farmers, try things out on your own farm. Try and find farmers on similar soil types and with similar cropping systems that have moved to a regenerative system or adopted some of these principles. See if you can visit and talk to them, find out what went well. And, Andy's been great at sharing, what didn't go well. And it's good to learn from those experiences as well. So I think try things out on your farm. It's important for us to recognise that all farms need to develop their own systems and kind of adapt practices and work out what works well for them. And I think we do see that those farmers that have this kind of attitude of trying things out, trialing different things, they tend to be the farms that are most likely to be successful with those changes.
Is there any reason, do you think, why regenerative agriculture could not become the standard across the UK?
So I think the principles that we talked about are sound and have relevance to all farms. The extent to which the farms can adopt the principles will depend on the soil type and farming system. So, we need to be mindful of potential implications for adopting the principles in the wrong scenarios that could have negative impacts on production, which then in turn could, result in increased imports of food. So, for example, some soil types are more susceptible to compaction than others, so it might be harder to move to complete zero tillage system. Doesn't mean the principle of reduced tillage isn't relevant. It just means that how they achieve it might be different. Another example Andy flagged about integrating livestock, that might not work on all farms. It requires staff time, specific skill sets, and fencing and water infrastructure. So it comes back to what we've said already about having a flexible approach, try things out on the farm and working out what works well for the farm and the system.
And I've got a question about the role of soil scientists, obviously. What do you think is the approach that soil scientists need to take to bridge the gap between research and day-to-day practice?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, because I'm a soil scientist, I'm not a farmer. I have a veg patch, but I'm not a farmer. I think as soil scientists, we need to do our best to understand the practicalities of farming systems and to try to build close working relationships with farmers. So our research needs to be directly relevant to the farmers. The best way of doing that is to carry out research on commercial farms and to involve the farmers, as part of that research. We also need to make sure that the results of the research are widely available and communicated in a way that's easy to understand. We to understand that not everyone's going to read 100-page research reports. I think there's always room for improvement. I think on the whole, we're pretty good at doing this.
And are you seeing more farmers take the approach that we've talked about? And if so, how has it affected their business models? And most importantly, the health of the soil on their farms?
Yeah, so there's definitely growing interest in regenerative agricultural practices, as Andy said about groundswell, and all those farmers that we're hearing from. It's really encouraging, particularly for me, to hear feedback from farmers who tell us they've made changes to practices and they're actually starting to see visible improvements to their soils. Some farmers also tell us that they've been able to lower the cost of production by reducing their input costs. However, we have to be mindful also that we are aware of other examples where, say, moving to reduced tillage has reduced yields. And if then the value of that yield reduction is more than any cost savings, that could impact on that could negatively impact on financial viability. So yeah, again, flexible and adapting practices to suit individual farms.
And finally, any advice that you'd care to give Kate and Andy and how they run their respective farms?
In terms of how you run your farms, that's a big question. But more generally, I think I'd say to you both, with your public profiles, you're both in a really good position to be advocates for the importance of soil. So, Kate, with your link to the society, it'd be really great if we could get more people and more of the general public enthused and caring about soils. Andy, we like to try and encourage farmers to try things out on the farms. I noted you said earlier about your decade of R&D. We quite often it's encourage farmers to try and do split field or tramline comparisons. So I would say, keep doing what you're doing, more of that, and sharing your findings with others. And we look forward to hearing more from you.
Brilliant, thank you. So, Kate, let me ask: are you open to having a major scientific experiment in your small holding?
Absolutely.
Can we send a bunch of scientists to visit you?
I think in a way this is the conundrum, because as Andy said, farming is a 365-day-a-year job. You can't take a holiday from farming. And, it's easy for us to sit around and say, well, farmers should try things out. But, that all takes headspace, as well as a leap of faith, as well as thinking, well, maybe I need to take some of my land out of production that I normally do. But hang on a second, what about the payments that I'm paid, per yield? There's a lot of things that probably need to be looked at with regards to, farming incentives to allow farmers to actually try things out. And I think one of the really difficult things, and we basically need to clone Lizzie and all the members of BSSS and send them out to farms, because I think a lot of farmers would be receptive to trying things and to doing things, but kind of need somebody to say, this is how you start. This is, they kind of need the help and support. We're doing a number of things on our farm at the moment, working very closely with the National Landscapes on their kind of increasing biodiversity program, and Tim Stevens, who as I say is the farmer that I basically just get in the way of and make his life a nightmare. But Tim has been amazing, because for him, he can have direct conversations with somebody and say, well, I've noticed that sometimes we have curlew in these fields. They're not nesting, but sometimes they're here. What can I do to increase the possibility that curlew might nest here? And he's got somebody he can ask. And I know it sounds like a really simple thing, but sometimes that's what you need. You need somebody who can say, you know what, it's not that complicated. If you did this, it will help. But if your head is full of just trying to make ends meet, just trying to deal with a drought that we're having now, or it's another thing to think about. And as Andy said, farming is hard enough. So some sort of collaborative support network, if there can be, it's a bit pie in the sky, because there are a lot of farmers and everybody's busy. There needs to be some sort of means of not just saying to farmers, give it a go, but saying, this is how. And I think that's what Andy's done so brilliantly with Wildfarmed, is, like you were saying, Andy, coming up with a set of guidelines that are very clear, that enable people to actually go, okay, I can do this because I've got the instructions. I don't have to spend hours on the internet trying to find out what I'm allowed to do or what I'm not allowed to do. It's facilitating people to make change, because I really strongly believe that there are lots of people who'd be willing to do it. It's just quite hard to get on with it.
Andy, would you echo those comments?
Well, yeah, I think it's, in our experience anyway, first of all, you get what you incentivize. And so if you want to move from yield to quality food from nature-rich landscapes, then you need to create a supply chain that incentivizes those outcomes. Otherwise, you've got no chance of getting them. Yeah. And then, as Kate was saying, what we found is that you need to take those incentives and then make it practical. And what that means is making farmers part of a community, peer-to-peer learning, field days, open days, agronomy support, technical support, and really giving people a kind of whole network around them to do a deep dive, and not on all their farm, but on part of their farm, try a fundamental mindset shift and try something fundamentally different. Run that alongside their existing system and see how it looks. And then at the other end of that, if you want to build this into a movement, then we need consumers who can then participate too, which again requires them being linked to the farmers. And actually, that's a double-edged sword, because one of the things that we've found really powerful for our growers is the ability to do what almost no arable farmers have ever done, which is to eat what they've grown. And the simple act of eating what you grow in itself is a very powerful piece in this puzzle.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Eat what you've grown is a very, very powerful statement. Okay, a couple of closing questions for you, because you've recently become patron of the British Society. Why did you decide to take on this role?
Because I think, as you sort of intimated at the beginning, our soils are overlooked, really, and taken for granted. People don't really think of soil as first as an ecosystem, and as also as the thing that underpins all sorts of other ecosystems that we know and love. And in a funny sort of way, everyone says the Brits love to champion an underdog, and as someone who has wanted to champion various aspects of conservation over my years and career, I've chosen a few underdogs. The marine world, 20, 25 years ago, we really struggled to get people to care about the sea, because for a lot of people, the perception of the sea was that it was just a giant body of water. And even though they might have cared about dolphins, or there was this sort of odd disconnect between the sea and what lived in it, and the health of the seas and how that affected what lived in it. That's changed, I'm happy to say, over the years. I mean, it's still not by any means fixed, and but at least people are thinking about the marine environment in a different way. Another of my underdogs are wetlands, which, again, because they're not obviously beautiful to a lot of people, they don't have the kind of visual impact of a woodland or a wildflower meadow, and they can. I mean, I'm going to say this. I'll probably now be sacked as president of WWT, but I'm going to say this. They can look a bit sort of bleak and unloved and a little bit muddy. Let's face it. But there is glory in that mud. There is life in that mud, and that's why you get this tremendous amount of biodiversity, of life, of nature, of things that flap and crawl and squeak and scamper in wetlands. They are remarkable places, and anyone who cares about locking in carbon and thinks that planting trees is the only answer, well, I'm afraid to say wetlands are they're more effective and they do it quicker, which is not to say we don't want to plant trees. Let's have trees, but we can have both. I mean, you said in the introduction, I love mud. I do. I've always loved mud. I used to make, when you grew up in the 70s, making mud pies was the equivalent now of, doing international gaming on your PlayStation. But, for me, it is an incredibly vibrant, exciting, interesting ecosystem. It is the basis of life itself. There is nothing more important than the earth literally beneath our feet. And if I, as a non-scientist and a non-expert really in anything, can make, other non-scientists and other non-experts, because there's quite a lot of us about, understand and care, and it's not just caring, it's actually getting excited about, what soil is, what soil does, who it supports, what it facilitates, then I feel like I can be a decent patron. And as I say, I just want to be a mud champion.
Fabulous. And in terms of public understanding of the importance of soil and the role of soil science, what do you think needs to change in terms of that understanding?
It's not a sort of rebranding exercise exactly, but it is just, in the same way that we've seen that kind of gradual shift in understanding and caring about the marine environment. The same thing needs to happen with people's understanding and sort of level of empathy, if you like, towards soil, and seeing it not just as mud, in the same way as seeing the sea not just as a big, as a giant bucket of water, but seeing it as a vibrant, living, and giving entity. So I'm going to need to put my kind of rebranding hat on, I think, and just, work with people like Lizzie and the other scientists at the Society to come up with ways that feel inclusive, exciting, that aren't too technical, and that allow people to take great pleasure in having really dirty fingernails.
Fabulous. Kate, Lizzie, Andy, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks for listening to this month's edition of Soil Matters. Subscribe on Spotify, Acast and Apple Podcasts to make sure that you hear the next episode as soon as it's uploaded. If you'd like to follow up on any of the topics that we've discussed today, go to the podcast pages of the BSSS website. And to learn more about our two journals, to become a member or discover more about the British Society of Soil Science, follow soils.org.uk. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Professor Jack Hannam, and I'm a soil scientist, and I'm past president of the British Society of Soil Science. Did you know the health of our soil affects everything? Our food, our climate, our health, and our future. Formed in 1947, the British Society of Soil Science is a professional membership body. dedicated to protecting, improving, and discovering new knowledge about the foundation of our planet, soil. From developing cutting-edge research, engaging with international and domestic governments through science-led policy and advocacy, to publishing in leading sector journals, and accessing extensive educational resources, our members are given the tools to be at the forefront of shaping a sustainable future. Our members are central to making a real impact and facilitating lasting change. Through access to our extensive networks, they can connect with experts and drive the conversation on soil health worldwide. Join a passionate community committed to tackling the future generational climate, biodiversity and food security challenges. Don't wait, get involved today, because soil is where it all begins, and soil matters now more than ever. Find out more at soils.org.uk.